In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to use Hybrido particles inside of RealFlow. Okay, so thinking about some of the simulation methods that we've looked at up to this point, on one end of the spectrum we have our traditional fluid-based particles. Now these are going to be best for simulating really small to fairly medium-sized bodies of water. Now on the far opposite side of that we have something like our real waves, which we looked at in one of our earlier lessons. Now this is going to be really good for simulating very, very large open bodies of water. Now Hybrido is kind of an in-between, sort of a mix of the two. So with Hybrido we have the ability to simulate something that is going to be particle-based, like our traditional fluids. At the same time though, we have the ability to simulate something that is going to be much, much larger in scale, something closer to what we would normally be able to get with the size of our real waves. So let's start by going ahead and creating the first thing. So these Hybrido particles need to exist inside of a domain. Now the domain you can think of as basically being just the container for our particles. So our particles cannot exist without this container, and these Hybrido particles are not able to exist at any time outside of this container. So this is an absolute container that we're going to be working with. Now once we have this domain created, we now need to build ourselves an emitter. Now Hybrido relies on a piece of geometry as an emitter, so we can really use anything we want. In this case, I'll use maybe something like a cube, and I can take this and scale it out so that it is a little bit larger. And now with this cube selected, let's go back to our Hybrido menu and choose Emitter. Now if I were to press the A key on my keyboard, you can see that as soon as we start simulating that this cube gets filled up with these Hybrido particles. However, you can see they're really not doing much at the moment. That's because we still need to have things like gravity in the scene, so let's go in and add in a gravity emitter, or a gravity daemon, rather. Now I'll go ahead and press the A key on my keyboard to start my simulation once again. And right away, now you can start to see our Hybrido particles starting to splash out and simulate. Okay, so you can see looking at this that these actually tend to simulate pretty quickly. If I were to select my domain, we can actually see that right now we're simulating around 80,000 particles, and these are actually, you can tell, simulating relatively quickly. So this becomes, like I said, a really, really good sort of in-between for getting fluid-based, or rather particle-based effects, but still getting something that is a little bit larger in scale, similar to a real wave. Now these grid fluids are really, like I said, going to be good for open or larger containers of water. So the trade-off is that while they do simulate much, much faster than our traditional fluid-based particles, these Hybrido particles really are not able to capture the same amount of detail and the same little subtle splashes and things that are able to be contained and calculated by these other particles. So that's really sort of the trade-off that we have. It's really just a matter of sacrificing speed, or rather sacrificing detail, in order to actually gain some speed. So if I were to come in and take my emitter, or rather my object that we're going to be using as our emitter, we could take this and actually have it fill up our entire domain. Now, just to make this a little bit easier to see, I'll go ahead and take my cube and hide that. Now if I were to start my simulation, you can see that we really kind of start off almost with this nice settled little bed of particles. Now inside of a domain we can actually have multiple emitters. So if I were to create another cube and maybe scale this up just a little bit larger and place this back over here somewhere, again with this selected, we'll go up to our Hybrido list and select emitter. I'll take my cube 2, hide that as well, again just so it's a little bit easier to see. Reset my simulation and set this off again. So you can see without having to make another domain, we can place as many emitters as we want inside of it. And what we should see is that any of these particles that get created will automatically interact with each other. So now you can see we have these particles that are splashing down, and they're going to start to spread out and splash around. And again, at this point, with these new particles, you can see we're simulating a little over 200,000 particles at the moment. Alright, so we'll just let this simulate for a few more seconds here. And again, if I were to come in here and actually use my video preview come in here and actually see just how this is playing through. So here's our little splash. You can see it starts to come up. And again, looking at this, you can tell that it really doesn't have nearly the amount of detail and the amount of subtle splashes that we get with our traditional fluid-based particles. But overall, for simulating larger open bodies of water, this does a really, really nice job for us. So when it comes to actually resizing our domain, it's really just as simple as taking our scale tool and just simply scaling that out. Now in our case, you can see that these particles are actually stretching, and that's completely normal. That's something that will get fixed up as soon as we actually reset our simulation. So I'll go back to my cube 1, and with this selected, let's go ahead and just make that visible once again. And I'll go ahead and just scale that out. We'll want to make sure that, in my case, that it is covering the entire area of our particles, or rather our domain. Now, you will notice looking at this that I do have parts of my cube that actually fall outside of this domain. And that's really not a great deal of concern, because you can see as soon as we start our simulation, even though we have this entire cube set to be our emitter, these fluid particles, or these hybrido particles, are only created inside of this domain. And you can see that as soon as we reset that simulation and let that resimulate, that everything behaves exactly as it should. Now, when it comes to adjusting the actual resolution of this domain, what we first need to do is just simply select it, and then we can adjust our resolution from this area right up here. And this will adjust the resolution of any emitters that are actually contained inside of it. So if I press Control A to reset, if I were to set my resolution down to instead of 100,000, maybe something like 10,000, you can see that these little cubes up here in the corner of my domain have now become much, much larger. And this is essentially just sort of the area of sampling, or the grids that these fluid or hybrido particles will be generated within. So essentially we now have a total of 10,000 of these little cubes stacked within here. And we can actually see this if we were to go down to our display and set the domain to something like cells. Now we can actually see all of these little cells inside here that make up these 10,000 little grid cells. That's again where all of our little fluids are calculated independently. Alright, so we can set that maybe back to none. And now, with this set to a much lower resolution, if I were to press the A key on my keyboard to set off my simulation, you can see now we wind up with a much, much lower number of particles, but again, our simulations happen much, much faster. So likewise, if we were to come in and instead of 10,000, maybe take that up to 200,000, which the default was 100,000, and again, set my simulation off, you'll notice that definitely a little bit of a slowdown. It's taking a little bit longer, but at this point now we're simulating over 325,000 particles. So considering the fact that we're actually simulating so many particles, this is actually moving relatively quickly. Alright, and then once that's done, we can just scrub through here and take a look at that. Alright, so once that's finished simulating, you can see that we have now about 325,000 particles simulated over 200 frames, and looking down here, you can see that it's simulated that in just a little over 3 minutes. So definitely very, very impressive simulation times, considering how many particles we have here. Now, something to keep in mind is that this really is just a very, very introductory look at Hybrido. Now, within Hybrido, we actually have a tremendous amount of features found within this. We can start to add, again, things like foam, mist, splash particles, lots and lots of additional controls that we have over our end result. So if you'd like to learn more about Hybrido, we actually do have an entire course dedicated to talking about Hybrido and its features. Now, this course is called Using Hybrido in RealFlow. And this course will give you a much, much more in-depth look and a much more comprehensive look at this really, really amazingly powerful feature. So for now, this has been an introductory look at how we can start to use Hybrido inside of RealFlow.